Hi everyone. So it's week 5 of Sociology, and me and Miss Abbas have decided to change our plans a little bit because we think, we just can't ignore this huge scandal that's occurred recently with George Floyd. It's so incredibly relevant to sociology and it's what we look at. And I think me and Miss Abbas were talking, and this really is why we kind of love sociology so much, find it so interesting, because I think a lot of people at the moment, their kind of eyes are being opened to society and how it's constructed. And sociology is a kind of a way of putting on lenses to understand the world. So we look at inequality, we look at racial inequality, and the kind of the causes of it and the manifestations from it. And so we just felt like it was incredibly relevant, really, for us to use the recent news around George Floyd as a basis to talk to you this week about inequality. So, looking at this image, what is it showing? How does it make you feel? And do you know what is the Black Lives Matter movement? I'd really recommend, it's so important for sociology because we're really talking about current affairs. It's really useful to be keeping an eye on the news and what's happening because it really influences our kind of everyday life. So keep an eye on the news, and I'd really recommend you keeping up to date with this story in particular. Okay, so as I've said, it's incredibly relevant to look at social inequality at this time, because sociology explores many social issues, including, like I've said, social inequality, injustice, and unequal life chances. You will explore many issues throughout this course that will help you to understand the many divisions in society. So we look at, from a feminist perspective, why they argue that men do better in society than women. We look at, from a Marxist perspective, why all the kind of different groups that are marginalised don't do as well as those who are in charge, the bourgeoisie, which is predominantly the white, rich Western males. So we look at all these different groups and we look at inequality as a whole. So this is really interesting, I think. This study, sociological study by Jane Elliott, Blue Eyes and Brown Eyes. I'm just going to read this for you. So Elliott taught third graders at school in, oh gosh, I don't know how to say that. Let's go for Riceville, Iowa. Elliott separated the blue-eyed children from the children with brown and green eyes. So the only thing that separated them was the colour of their eyes. She had the blue-eyed children put on green construction paper armbands, and then she told the children that the brown-eyed students were smarter. Elliott sent the brown-eyed children to lunch first and gave them a longer recess. The brown-eyed children could drink from a water fountain, but the blue-eyed children had to use paper cups. The change was instant, Elliott said. The children with brown eyes were suddenly more confident and condescending. They hurled nasty insults at the blue-eyed kids. The children with blue eyes made silly mistakes and became timid and despondent. The two groups stopped playing together. Fights broke out. So I just want you to have a little think about, why are we telling you about this study? How is it relevant, and how does it have parallels between this and what's happened with George Floyd? Okay, so I'm sure loads of you know the story. It's hard to kind of get away from it at the moment. It's certainly all over my Facebook feed and everything. But just in case you're not exactly sure what I'm talking about and what's happened with George Floyd, here's a bit more information on this slide to give you a bit of an update on what's happened. And I mean, I think it's really important, and I think if we shy away from these issues, then we're not helping them. So I would really recommend going onto YouTube and looking at the video where you see George Floyd be killed underneath the knee of the officer. And it's hard to watch, but I think that's why it's so important to watch, because I think that's what's gone wrong so many times in history, that people have looked the other way to inequality and to wrongdoings. So I think it's actually really important that we take a look at this, so I'd really recommend it. We've got two key terms here. So we've got cultural discrimination. That is where someone is discriminated against, so treated poorly based off their cultural background. And then we've got structural discrimination. So that's where in society, so there is a structure in place that means someone is discriminated against. So for example, especially thinking back to kind of the 1920s, 1930s America, when racism was kind of really at a height, especially in the South of America, and you know, black people and white people had to use different water fountains, use different toilets, stuff like that. So there was structures, there was things in place that made black people, that made them discriminated, so seen as inferior. This can also be kind of use a term in institutionalized discrimination, so institutionalized like racism, which is something we cover in sociology, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second. So as sociologists, what can we learn from the case study of George Floyd? So we discuss lots of these kind of things in sociology. I'm just going to point you to some of the facts on the screen. So only 13% of the general population in Britain is made up of black people. Whereas if you go into a prison, 40% of the British prison population is made up of black people. So that's where we start to question, is it because black people are more inherently criminal, or is it because we've got this prejudice against black people that we think they're more criminal? And that's what we look at as sociologists, and we find things like how certain areas where a greater population of black people live, they're much more likely to have a police presence. Black people are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. As you can see there in the top left, black drivers are 30% more likely to be pulled over. So actually we start to question, well, are black people more inherently criminal? No, I absolutely completely disagree with that. I think a lot of the time police are looking more towards the black people, so inevitably when they're being looked at, they're put in prison more. So these are the issues that we talk about, and it's really, really interesting. And black Americans are 2 times more likely to be unemployed. I mean, the statistics are completely against this group of people. Yeah, I'll move on. So I've talked about institutional racism, and to give you a bit more information on that, this is something that was a real issue that was raised following the Stephen Lawrence investigations. So when a Macpherson report concluded its investigation to the police inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, it reached a shocking conclusion that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist. So pause the video here, read the other information on the screen. But basically, Stephen Lawrence was a young boy, young black boy, who was killed by the police, and it was an absolute catalyst. Similar really to what's happened with George Floyd recently. It was an absolute catalyst for looking into the police and looking into institutional racism, and it was found, as said, that the Metropolitan Police was an institution that was fundamentally racist, and lots of things have been done since to try and address this issue and to prevent it from happening. But as you can see from recent events, clearly more still needs to be done. Yeah, I mean, this is just shocking, and it's a really horrible subject, but it's so important that we learn about it. I think just pause the video really and have a look over this slide as well. So as you can see, one of the kind of highest causes of death among young men in America is the police and encounters with police going wrong. That 1 in 1,000 young black men who have an encounter with the police ends in a death. So what sociology does is it looks at issues and current issues and looks at society in new different ways, and then we put on the lenses of different theorists to try and unravel and find out the root of these issues. So we're going to look at Marxism and what they think. So Marxists argue that society, in order for it to continue in a way that benefits the capitalist structure, few must stay rich, the bourgeoisie, whilst many remain poor. So, and they argue that social mobility, so being able to move from working class to middle class, is really difficult. And they argue that capitalism is the root cause of inequality. So it justifies some people not doing as well whilst others have the power, the money, stuff like that. Now I've put this poster up for In Time. I really like this film. I think it's really interesting. It's a brilliant concept. I'd really recommend you watching it. I watched it again recently. It's on Prime at the moment. You might be able to find it on Netflix or something. But it's a really interesting concept where instead of money, people, the currency is time. So at the age of, I think it's 25, you have a clock on your arm and you go to work, you get paid, but in time. You pay for food in time, stuff like that. So the kind of catchphrase of the film is, for few to be immortal, so to live forever, many must die. And I think it just really kind of brings it home the levels of inequality that we have in society. I think it makes it just really obvious that you literally die when you're out of money. And I would argue that that basically happens in society today, but it's less direct, so it's easier to ignore. Moving on to the feminist perspective. So feminists argue that our society is patriarchal. We've used this term a lot. It means male dominated. And as long as that continues, men will have greater opportunities and more power than women. That they argue that men are the root cause of inequality. So you might have heard of the term a glass ceiling, that kind of women can look up at the top jobs but can't get there. There's this invisible ceiling blocking their way. And I mean, even if you look at schools, it's really interesting. The vast majority of teachers in schools are women, yet I think it's less than 20% of head teachers are females. So there you've got lots of women doing their kind of base job, but very few get into the top. And I think that cartoon just sums it up pretty well. Hopefully you're seeing a bit of a pattern now. We look at Marxists, we look at feminists, and we look at functionalists. And yet again, functionalists hold a more kind of positive view. So functionalists argue that inequality is essential to the preservation of society characterised by cohesion, consensus, cooperation, stability and persistence. They argue that social inequality motivates people to fill the different positions in society that are needed for the survival of the whole. So this idea is kind of social stratification. They argue that we need, we can't all do the same job. I talk a lot about the body when it comes to functionalism because I use it a lot as an analogy. So the head might seem, or the brain might seem like a really powerful part of the body, but actually if we don't have our little finger, it's going to make things difficult. So we need all our parts of the body in order to function, or we need all the cogs in the machine in order for it to work. And so that's what functionalists are saying, that we need people to do all sorts of jobs in order for everything to be fulfilled. And this is the idea of social stratification, that certain people will do certain jobs and others, will fill them all out. And then this actually motivates people that if, in order to get a great wage, a comfortable house, multiple cars, brilliant holidays or whatever, those goals motivate you to work hard to get a great job. Now we all won't be able to get there, but they argue that, well, that's fine because we need to fill out all the different roles in society. We can't all be at the top. So we just thought it was really important to acknowledge and to use this as a lesson. As it says there, the whole world should use George Floyd's death as a catalyst for a fairer future. Now I'm a firm believer that if we don't educate ourselves on the inequalities and the hardships in society, then we're never going to make a better society. So that's why we've taught it you today. Okay, that's the end of this week. not a very cheery subject, but a really important, really relevant one. So I hope you found it interesting. It's complicated stuff that we're talking about. So if needs be, I'd really recommend going back over it, pausing it, making some notes, making sure you understand the intricacies of the things I'm talking about. Once you've done that, follow the link, test your knowledge on quizzes, and we look forward to seeing your results. See ya!